Hello and welcome to today's CDCT Live. I'm Jason Rader and I'll be your host. Today's topic is on delivering connectivity through community wireless broadband. And with me, I've got two great guys that are going to help us through this conversation. We've got Mike Moore, Practice Development Manager, and Mike Parmalee, Professional Services Manager here with me at CDCT. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Jason, Mike.
So we have had a previous session related to Citizens Broadband Radio. And the topic was more around municipalities and those kinds of things. And we'll get to that in a bit. But I still think it'd be good, since we've already covered the topic, to talk a little bit about, start at the beginning and talk a little bit about what is CBRS? What are we talking about when we say community Wi-Fi? And Mike, why don't you handle that? Just joking.
I'll assume you're talking to this, Mike, so I'll start first. So, I mean, when we're talking about community broadband wireless, really it's just providing that connectivity in an outdoor venue. I mean, as we're looking at the digital divide use case that you brought up, or pandemic response, those were initially the two really big use cases that were addressing immediate needs that we saw across the board, really. So providing that connectivity, whether it was Wi-Fi, whether it's through CBRS or private LTE, both viable options. Just depends on what you're really trying to do. If you're trying to get signal within a house, or if you're just trying to cover public spaces, which technology is going to make the most sense. I mean, I think there's a lot of confusion about what Wi-Fi is versus CBRS. And hopefully we'll try to kind of clear that up today as we talk. But I mean, in its simplest form, we've known Wi-Fi for years, right? Our phones leverage Wi-Fi, they connect to our networks, laptops use it. There's not really anything you need. Like if we're talking cellular, you typically need a SIM card to connect. But Wi-Fi is inherently built into almost every technology or device that we have in our hands today. So Wi-Fi is pretty much pervasive when we go into the enterprise, when we go into schools now, healthcare, pretty much every vertical we can think of. But CBRS is more new, cutting edge, typically handled by cellular providers in the past. But now we're getting that capability where we could stand up private LTE infrastructures and kind of reap some of the benefits that we don't necessarily get with Wi-Fi, depending on the need that you're trying to address. Anything to add to that, Mr. Parmalee?
No, I think you pretty well covered it. Just another comment on what CBRS is. I mean, really, it's a new spectrum. Well, not a new spectrum. It's been out for a while, but it's a spectrum that's available now, both to private individuals as well as some of the incumbents, right? So there's some spectrum there that's been made available, so companies and municipalities, et cetera, can go out there and actually utilize that space, right? And again, when we talk CBRS, that's really the spectrum per se. The technology behind it that connects everything is what we can refer to as a CBRS LTE solution, right? And so there's definitely some benefits, some big benefits to using a CBRS solution versus, say, a traditional Wi-Fi solution, right? A lot of it has to do with the capabilities of CBRS, especially from an outdoor perspective. That's what everybody is kind of aware of. However, inside an enterprise, inside buildings, it's equally as good, right? So there's a lot of benefits and pros to using a CBRS solution versus Wi-Fi. And it also is a great complement to Wi-Fi, right? And we can talk about some of that stuff. So at a very high level, right, there's a couple of solutions when we talk broadband, whether it's community or enterprise-based, right? So it's standard Wi-Fi or traditional Wi-Fi versus CBRS, or even versus like the radios that we know of today, right? Sorry, I had a little noise there.
Sound like you shorted out for a minute.
Yeah.
Well, I think, when I said wow after Mike, just as much wow, because I think there's so much there to kind of talk about. It's really interesting to me. I think one of the reasons Wi-Fi in general, the 802.11 spec, has been so pervasive is a lot because of that unlicensed nature of it, right? Is that you can throw up those devices without having to do anything. And a lot of people don't realize that when you start dealing with radio spectrums and in general, the FCC and in our country and in other countries, there's just as much regulatory going on. You just can't park stuff up in those frequencies without planning and having the appropriate licensing in some cases.
Yeah, right. And I mean, with Wi-Fi that we've been working with for years, I mean, if you're a Wi-Fi guy or an architect and you're used to dealing with the antennas and the power levels that you're allowed to use, obviously that's regulated on a country by country basis, but it's unlicensed spectrum. So, I mean, you have a set number of channels that you can use, whether it's in that 2.4 or 5 gigahertz range. And really it's open for business wherever you want to go. When we start looking at CBRS, you get that trade-off of, we can do some really cool stuff. We can do larger ranges, but now we're going into a slightly licensed spectrum where you have your incumbents and then you have general access use for specific parts of that spectrum. And that's where a lot of these enterprises and municipalities are getting their hands into it early, where they can get that licensed spectrum within that 3.5 gigahertz range. And they're starting to stand up their own private infrastructures on top of that. And that is one of the big things. I mean, being lightly licensed, there's the FCC is regulating that. You have a system that sees what power, what channels that you're broadcasting at. So a little bit different mindset than we saw with the Wi-Fi networks of the past. Well, and continuing to go forward, that we're playing in this space where we can license it, and that's ours to use in that area. So pretty cool, but also just another challenge that we have to look at as we're adopting new technologies like CBRS and private LTE.
Yeah, in fact, and that's a good point, just to add on to it. So we're talking about CBRS, right, versus traditional Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is pretty much best effort, throw it out there, unlicensed, you get what you get, right? A lot of contention and all this other stuff. The benefits with the CBRS spectrum is that they're entities. Actually, it's a collective group of what are called SaaS providers. That's basically like a spectrum access system. And essentially what they do is they actually manage, they monitor, essentially every radio, every AP that goes up out there, right? So this collective group is actually out there monitoring the same database. They put sensors out through all of the areas that they own, right? Or they own a license to or whatever. And the benefit to that is when you're turning up a new site, you can leverage that database. You can leverage these SaaS providers to validate where you can put your radios, your antennas. You can start doing predictive surveys and those sorts of things, so that you have a pretty darn good chance of what you're designing for to be what you roll into production, right? So from an operational perspective, performance perspective, you should be pretty much dead on. And that's one of the key benefits, is that with the SaaS providers, it is a requirement, by the way. You can't even turn these things up until you've registered and gone through a SaaS provider and put your designs out there and everything. So there's definitely pluses to that. Even though it's a shared spectrum, there still are constraints, and there's a lot of thought behind where the infrastructure sits today and potential for interference, right? And that's what these SaaS providers do. That's a key thing to think about, is that it is definitely managed on the back end, and that provides a level of comfort, in my opinion, when you're investing in that infrastructure and rolling out a CBRS LTE solution. So one of the big differentiators.
It reminds me a little bit of in the old days with like the Internet Assigned Number Authority, where you had to register your IP address, or a range of them, so that you could use those and not conflict with other folks. I mean, it's a similar type, but that authority needs to exist so you don't step on or have a conflict with other people. And you can, like, to your point, Mike, I can just say that, any Mike, to your point,
Yeah.
You're not stepping all over. You can plan appropriately for the channels and the frequencies that you're using.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Big benefit.
I think, so we've already, and for those of you who are out there listening, that sounds to me, if I'm coming in fresh to this, that sounds complicated. Why wouldn't I just throw more access points at something if I needed more bandwidth? What are the benefits of doing this? And obviously this isn't a rip and replace solution. Wi-Fi and this type of environment can coexist to complement each other.
Yeah, well, and I think it comes down to use cases, right? And that's the big thing. At a high level, in a nutshell, right? If you compare, say, Wi-Fi with CBRS, I mean, CBRS definitely from an outdoor perspective. If you got a vast area, that normally would be too expensive or cumbersome to throw a bunch of we'll call traditional Wi-Fi access points out there, whether it's meshed or whatever. That can get pretty expensive, right? You may have to put in a lot of poles, you may have to put in power, right? All those things. So not to mention the number of APs that from an outside perspective that you could cover versus say, a Cbrs type solution with the radios that they have out there, and again, these are just high level metrics, but from an outdoor perspective, you could expect like anywhere from 15 to 25 to 1, right? If you go from a 1-to-1 perspective on coverage, right? Number of access points or radios that would be put out there
So I'd have 25 access points versus 1 CBRS.
Right. And again, these are obviously rough numbers. It could be higher, it could be lower, but terrain and all those other things come into play, like with any traditional wireless. I guess the point here is that, yeah, although you can do that with Wi-Fi, we've done it, others have done it, right, out of necessity. It comes down to use case, right? What is it that you need to get out of it? What's the cost model look like? What's the coverage requirements, right? How many devices? What's the latency requirements? These are all key things that you take into consideration when you're trying to figure out, okay, will standard Wi-Fi work, or should I look at something like a Cbrs LTE solution, right? And then there's security, right? That's another piece of it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of feasibility planning that's going to come into that to figure out which solution does make the most sense. Mike hit on several of those key aspects, but whether or not it's going to be Wi-Fi and you're doing outdoor mesh connectivity, or maybe you're even leveraging Cbrs as the backhaul, so you can have Cbrs LTE network stood up where that acts as the medium between all of your wireless access points, and maybe you transition into smart city initiatives and you have a switch on a light pole that's monitoring traffic and lights and all that fun stuff. But as we're talking about the manageability of the solution as well, whether you want to have an AP or thousands of APs that are covering 200 to 300 square feet versus a CBRS cell that maybe you can get, like to Mike said, 1 to 25 ratio down, where you're managing way less devices. And from a support perspective, but it comes down to, do you have the real estate, the assets, the tower, all the things that go into putting up a CBRS network, where maybe you, if you're a city entity, you have access to light poles and you can put an AP on every light pole, but you don't necessarily have a tower for a CBRS radio to get high enough, things like that. So definitely a lot of considerations. Everything has its pros and cons. I think we talked about one of the first use cases was digital divide and how we address that. And we've seen clients address it both ways. We had another LinkedIn Live around City of Tucson, where we had Colin Boyce on here, talking about how they addressed it, and CBRS was the mechanism for that. So, and one of the reasons was because of that manageability, right? We wanted fewer devices that you had to touch, that you had to go out and support and have service on, and then also providing connectivity through structures into homes. So when you're looking at dense materials like brick and concrete, stucco, typically Wi-Fi doesn't like to pass through that very well, where cellular has a much higher propensity to be going through that. So putting in some kind of MiFi device or having devices in there that can convert that cellular signal to Wi-Fi has been crucial to some of these deployments, where in other instances we see putting an AP with traditional Wi-Fi on a light pole is quite sufficient. It just depends on the geographies. Doing the proper design, figuring out what's going to make sense for each individual neighborhood or entity, or pick your favorite use case, is just critical in determining which is going to be the best technology fit for that particular environment.
Yeah, I think, we've been talking about these outdoor and long throw kind of situations, and that's why we tend to go to those municipalities or those public sector type things. But this is not just a solution for public sector, right?
Right. No, I mean, that has been the immediate use case that we've seen. Pandemic response, getting internet into homes and underserved communities. Really, that was what we needed to address right now. That was critical. Right. We had to deliver online learning to students. We had teleworkers who needed access to do their day jobs. We had stand-up medical centers for vaccine and testing that we needed to provide access for. But really, that in the IPS field, that's positioning them, getting these systems in place for future initiatives, whether it's revenue generation, providing public Wi-Fi, smart cities initiatives like we've talked about. But really, it just spurred the innovation in the whole CBRS space. So on the enterprise side of the house, you look in like oil and gas, large manufacturing, mining operations, sporting venues. I mean, anywhere where you have large open spaces, whether it's an indoor warehouse or it's an open pit mine that you're trying to provide that coverage for, CBRS could be a very viable solution for that. In complements to traditional or replacement for Wi-Fi in some instances. It just, again, depends on that use case that you're going for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think,
to piggyback,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, to piggyback off of that, right? We definitely, we are having conversations with our enterprise customers as well. You know, they've seen what we've done in the private or the public sector here as well, and so we definitely are having those conversations. It's not just the public sector that's heard of CBRS. Obviously, you know, there are companies out there in different verticals that are reaching out and, you know, asking us to come and do workshops with them. And in some cases, you know, the big question is, you know, is this a rip and replace? Is this a new technology, right? Can we use our existing Wi-Fi? Absolutely, you can. You know, in fact, it works really well as an interim solution and, you know, works well alongside Wi-Fi. So as an example, right, if we look at healthcare, for example, having conversations with a few of our clients where we're looking at putting in an indoor CBRS solution with LTE for a couple of reasons, right? So if you think about healthcare, obviously it's critical systems, you know, they need low latency, they're bound by HIPAA requirements and all kinds of compliance things. So, you know, we talk about patient records and all those sorts of things. One of the benefits of putting in a solution like an indoor CBRS LTE is that we could offload, it's really two things, right? So you can offload some of the more bandwidth intensive things like, you know, video, CAT scans, you know, image shuffling, as well as securing patient documents, right? Because if you think about the private LTE, it's secure by nature, right? It's a multi-layered security kind of built in, right? So the channels are already encrypted. The second thing is any device that connects to the private LTE requires a SIM card, right? And the only way that that device can get on there is that SIM card has to be registered through a SaaS provider, et cetera. And that's the only way to get onto that network. So that's a second form of security, as well as you can put PIN codes in there, you know, so multi-layered security. And again, it doesn't have to be on net, it can be off net. So again, you can accomplish two goals by having a CBRS LTE network and Wi-Fi kind of working side by side. You can offload bandwidth intensive stuff, and more importantly, you can secure certain portions of your network. So a couple of interesting conversations.
Yeah, to tie onto that security too, I mean, when you're talking about segmenting CBRS networks, there's something called spectrum slicing, where you can choose maybe your silver, bronze, gold type tiers, and you could have maybe all of your public Wi-Fi in one of those slices, all of your IoT or smart city devices in another, and then pick your devices that go into that third tier. And you could slice that up however you want. But when it comes to a security and a quality of service perspective, that's how you can really classify what those devices are, what priority they have to that network, what amount of spectrum and throughput that they're going to be getting. And then that all integrates back into your underlying network and security infrastructure. So some of the solutions that we partner with today, some of our partners, they have integrations into their network access control solution. So you can provide identity and access and role-based access out at the CBRS and cellular level, just like we're doing with Wi-Fi networks today. So there's a lot of cool things that we can do in the enterprise space and also in the public sector space to address those security challenges and integrate with existing networks.
Yeah, and I think you addressed it a little bit, but to kind of address one of the comments that we've got on the stream is, you know, this is just another encapsulation method, right? So IP4, IP version 6, the applications, they don't care. This is just another manner of encapsulating it at the physical layer for those guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and so to touch on that a little bit, so one of the things that we didn't talk about is what encompasses a CBRS LTE network, if you will, right? So it's much more than just the spectrum, right? There's a couple other components that are involved in the end-to-end architecture, if you will. So we already mentioned the SaaS provider. There's also CBSDs, which are essentially the radios, antennas, etc., that sit out on the towers, right? Anything that emits the RF, and then there's what's called an evolved packet core, right? And that's kind of the heart, the brains, the glue, if you will, between the end user LTE network and private networks, and then going out to the internet, etc. And it's that EPC that essentially would be really a driver in things like IP4 versus IPv6, right? You would have to develop that within your infrastructure, and a lot of that stuff behind the scenes gets done in the EPC. And that's really the glue and the brains behind connecting all of this stuff together from an LTE CBRS perspective, and then into your own enterprise or public internet infrastructure. And it's a critical component. And since we're talking about EPC as well, just for the viewers here, there's a multitude of ways that you can have an EPC. You can have it fully managed, you can have it on-prem if latency is a concern, or you can do a hybrid method, right? So there's quite a few providers out there today that provide EPCs. You can certainly manage it yourself if you have the engineering expertise, right? You can call on Insight, right? We can help you with that as well. We can help solution that out. We've got great providers as well that we work with. But again, I just want to make it clear that we're not talking about just putting radios out there, right? Which is, if you're from a Wi-Fi background, legacy Wi-Fi, we'll call it, you put access points out, they come back, they backhaul to a network of some sort. Whereas with the CBRS solution, it's completely different in that, it's a fully integrated system, but there's different components to it, right?
Yeah. Well said. And I think that's that complexity that, again, you want somebody to kind of help you navigate this process typically. And, I think to your point, Mr. Moore, the spectrum slicing components of that open this up to other environments that we wouldn't typically think of having in the same environment, like a SCADA environment or something along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, the use case you decide to use or how you split up that spectrum is completely up to you. And another thing that I thought of while Mike was talking was when we talk about other use cases, enterprise use cases, when we think about traditional Wi-Fi and deploying, say, 50 APs in a warehouse to cover an area, how we get those onto the network, how we provide security, authentication, a little bit different when we start looking at the CBRS perspective. I mean, a lot of the functionality we're going to get can be the same, but how you approach security can be different, whether you're doing spectrum slicing, whether it's integrated with some kind of network access control solution to provide that. But also you can think about how we traditionally deployed these in the past, thinking about 50 APs and having autonomous devices, LGVs, or even in mines where you have autonomous mining vehicles or dump trucks going through the mines, and they relied on traditional Wi-Fi. If you think of the challenges that we've had with roaming in the past and the number of APs that we've had to place into a warehouse or into a mine to provide that kind of coverage, roaming has always been a challenge. So making sure that the power levels were right, making sure that the client device is talking back to those, we're able to do that roam successfully. The security protocols that we use to do fast transition, things like that. When we start looking at CBRS and maybe we put in 2 devices as opposed to 1, let's pick on the warehouse. If you have a laser guided forklift that's out there doing its operations, it's got a SIM card and that LTE capability to talk to that cell, it can spend its whole life on one side of the warehouse and never even have to roam. So, I mean, that whole challenge completely goes away. So it really is a game changer when you talk about designing these indoor Wi-Fi networks. And that's a hypothetical. I mean, maybe you need more than 2. When we get into warehouses and you have bottles of water or canned food, RF is going to change, right? We're gonna block that signal. But just the reduction in cells that we could potentially have inside those venues that is really promising when we start talking about automated initiatives like that.
Yeah. And I think there's a cost, there's cost of the devices, there's the complexity. I mean, it's a trade-off. Like you said, it's not just guaranteed we're going to do this way or this way. Mm-hmm. We got to kind of look at the specific situations. Yeah, definitely.
And Mike, you touched on a very important fact, right? So it's mobility, right? If you look at standard Wi-Fi, yeah, you can roam, right? From a Wi-Fi perspective, right? Roaming, we know from that arena that it's actually going from AP to AP. But when you think about roaming, in the public space, right? The incumbents and so on. You think about your phones, roaming to other networks. One of the key things here is the mobility factor in the roaming that comes to play with the CBRS LTE solution. So we've actually got one of our customers now that had a requirement, kind of came out of the blue and said, this is working great. However, we do have in some areas the need to actually provide internet access where we don't have infrastructure yet, although we're building it out. How do we solve for that? Well, because you've got a private CBRS LTE network, you can actually take those SIM cards, which belong to you and they're programmed to you, and you can put those in phones or devices that allow for a second SIM, right? And so what that does is, because in this particular case, this organization is managing their own Evolve Packet Core, they're able to integrate and coordinate and roam with like AT&T and Verizon, for example, right? So they could use that end device to basically roam on a provider's network. And then likewise, you can integrate and you can roam depending on how your PC is set up to work with other providers. So for example, in the enterprise space, you got somebody that's using their cell phone on their normal network. When they come into the office, you want them to be able to automatically roam into the corporate, CBRS network. And those are all things that you can do seamlessly because it's built into the technology that you can't do with standard Wi-Fi. So that's actually a big plus, and it's capturing a lot of attention both in the enterprise and the public sector. So again, right, it's just comparing the two technologies, integrating them, and figuring out what the use cases are is really what it comes down to.
No, that sounds awesome. I hadn't heard that use case before, but that's a game changer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, okay, we've talked. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Mike.
Well, and the other thing I just want to bring up real quickly too is 5G, right? That's the big buzz now, and there's a lot that's been going on in the 5G realm. So we work with specific vendors that have equipment that are ready to go with 5G, right? And so what we're doing when we're talking about customers and partners developing these solutions is that 5G is on the roadmap. So whatever we're architecting and deploying, we're absolutely making sure that the equipment that goes into the infrastructure is 5G capable in the future, because there's a lot of additional things you can do with 5G that are on the horizon that you'll be able to integrate into that existing infrastructure. So the play here really is, if you're going to invest in the infrastructure, all that time, money, and effort into it, we want to make sure that it's going to be able to still be viable 3 to 5 years now from now when you're going into 5G and beyond. So
yeah, good point. And I think that is there, and so let me ask two questions then. So is there a caveat to using this that I think I know the answer, I'm setting you guys up, right? Is using these technologies going to keep you from using other technologies, whether emerging or established? I think the answer is no, but.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think we've touched on it a couple of times that really it's a complementary thing. I mean, when we talk about Wi-Fi, I don't see Wi-Fi going anywhere for a while. Every laptop, phone, device that we have has a Wi-Fi chipset in it, like I talked about. So, I mean, it's not going to go away. We're going to be leveraging Wi-Fi from here till years to come. And I mean, private LTE is just going to be a complement to that. So depending on where you're deploying these, I mean, maybe you don't need that everywhere within the enterprise. Maybe it is just in a warehouse facility, for example, like we talked about, or maybe it's in mining operations. So covering those large outdoor spaces like a rail yard or lumber yard, I mean, pick your favorite kind of outdoor facility that you need to provide large amounts of coverage for. That's where CBRS could really complement that. But all the indoor spaces, maybe that's still a Wi-Fi infrastructure, and being able to integrate those two solutions where you can communicate openly between the devices really just gives you a little more flexibility in the tools that you have that you can address the different issues. So, I mean, I saw a question in the chat as well talking about having your own practice around CBRS. And I mean, it is a new technology. So there will be a learning curve, and working with SaaS providers, you do need to be a certified professional to do radio configurations, transmit powers, things like that. So if that's not something you have the in-house capabilities to do, there's people who provide those type of support services where they can manage and configure and do that as a service for you. So you don't necessarily need to build out a whole practice around it, but having some knowledge and expertise around the technology isn't going to hurt. But I mean, there's different approaches you can take to doing that.
And let me ask that question in a different way. Is there a transition of using like regular LTE to going to private LTE in a particular use case? If you don't feel that you've got the level of maturity in your organization to go to that private LTE implementation?
Yeah,
I mean,
I'll start it, and then maybe Mike can add on to that too from examples of some clients that we've done. But if you're doing traditional LTE right now and you're paying AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, pick your favorite. I mean, you're paying a monthly bill to those providers. Maybe you're paying on the data that you send. Right. So you have a lot of OpEx costs associated with that, right? And maybe CapEx associated for the LTV conversion. But think of your bill going to the service provider in that instance. So, I mean, you can use that, and we've seen clients use that for backups for SD-WAN solutions. But when you start looking at the private enterprise and having all of your own devices and wanting to communicate and getting that enhanced level security and having that private to you, that's where you really want to start looking more at a Cbrs solution so that you have more control over what comes in and off your network. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you can route that through your firewalls, and you have control over the solution, where if you're going through a service provider, you're really at the mercy of what they have, which we're all at the mercy. We're all tethered to our cell phones and other devices currently anyways. But when you start getting into private use cases, having that added layer of security and control is going to be really critical. So anyone using LTE today, I mean, like Mike said, there's devices that can do dual SIM cards. So as you're transitioning, you can put in the 5G or the Cbrs SIM card and be able to roam between both networks until eventually you migrate off, or maybe you keep that for redundancy. I mean, it just depends. Did I hit that well, Mike? Was there anything you wanted to add?
No, you did. I mean, really what it comes down to is cost ROI, right? So today,
that's what I read.
That's using Encompasses, et cetera, right? It's a pay for play model, right? So there's subscription by device. Not only that, but the data that's going in and out of the network, you have no control over, right? You don't own it. You can't see it. You can't monitor it. You might be able to monitor it to some degree, but you really don't own the data, right? And that's one of the benefits to private LTE solution is exactly that, right? You design it to your specific needs, which, by the way, if you're using incumbents, you can to a certain degree, right? But they're going to throttle things, and it's a shared medium, really, and it can get pretty, cost prohibitive. And not only that, but if it's in rural areas or rail yards, for example, right, where they normally don't have connectivity, or they just may not have incumbent towers somewhere, right? That's the thing, right? You do a private network with Cbrs, and you have control over that, and you can engineer and architect your private solution specific to your needs, right? Especially if you're anticipating a lot of devices that require low latency, right? Just there's a whole multitude of things that could be very expensive if you use one of the incumbent providers, right? That's the main benefit, is access to your data, the ability to engineer to your needs specifically, and to be able to expand, right, without breaking the bank.
Oh, thank you. Thanks both. So, we've come from the public sector applications of this. It sounds like there's use cases from a hospital, airports, hospitality, manufacturing, right? So there's a lot of potential opportunities to leverage these technologies together and separately. What would you guys suggest as a starting point for folks?
Knowing that use case is critical. So, I mean, whether you're addressing the immediate needs of getting internet into homes for the digital divide use case, whether it's working towards smart cities, or whether you're in the enterprise, figure out what that use case is, and then figure out which technology is going to make the most sense. I mean, going through that exercise of, is it feasible to go Cbrs? Does it make more sense to keep traditional Wi-Fi? But I mean, if you don't know your use case, you don't know which technology is going to make the most sense. And really, that's how we approach it when we work with our clients. We figure out what that use case is, figure out if they're trying to get signal into buildings, or how many users they're trying to cover, what types of devices they're trying to connect. So whittling down all those different things is really going to steer you in the right direction of which technology, or maybe a combination of both technologies. So starting there is good, and then understanding what you have in your infrastructure, how that's going to integrate with a large scale outdoor broadband wireless connectivity solution, making sure you have all the security mechanisms in place. Is there anything you need to add? Is there any bandwidth or core considerations you need to make to support that traffic? So there's a lot of little pieces that add up to a lot of big things that you need to take into consideration, but it starts with that use case.
Mr. Parmalee?
Yeah, dang, Mike, you kind of hit the nail on the head. You covered all the bases, really.
What do you say?
Really what it comes down to is having the workshops and the initial conversations, right? So there's the money aspect to it, obviously, right? There's things you can do from an OpEx, CapEx perspective that makes sense. That may be a key driver. Those are conversations we have with our customers all the time. The second piece is understanding what the actual use case or use cases are, right? Because that will depend on, what you need to do from an end-to-end solution. We can help you there as well.
And also the partnership piece, which we hit on before. I mean, if you're doing a large outdoor wireless network, you need to have partnerships in place. If you need real estate assets, you need to utilize fiber. A lot of times these large scale initiatives are going to be a co-op between a bunch of different entities. So making sure you have the right partnerships in place to be able to put a cell hub on top of a building or to install a new tower is going to be critical. And also any partnerships you may need that revolve around construction. Do you need to build new towers? Do you need new cabling infrastructure, fiber, copper, et cetera? So making sure you have those partnerships out front is going to be critical, so that not only you have someone who's going to help you along with that, but you have some stakeholders that have some skin in the game that can also help drive these future initiatives that go along with those systems.
Absolutely. I think, definitely we see adoption of this happening. So it's the opportunity now is just like when cloud became the thing that everybody wanted to do. We've got to take a thoughtful approach to doing this, because we don't just go to the cloud because the cloud is new and cool, right? Just the same as this. We've got to have that, what are we trying to accomplish conversation? And we're not trying to accomplish more bandwidth. We're trying to accomplish a business solution, or, digital divide was a great use case. We're trying to solve that problem, and how do we solve it? And then we piece these other pieces together. So I think that's definitely why it takes, somebody kind of thinking of the holistic aspects. It's going to take multiple parts of an organization to be able to come together to figure out how to do this appropriately, besides the external partnerships that need to exist in order for that to happen. So some very good things to think about.
Yeah, and that's a perfectly valid point, right? Because if you think of traditional IT, right, I think we all have a pretty good handle on that. But when you think about things like Cbrs solutions or Wi-Fi in general, it's not necessarily just one integrator, one solution provider at this point. I mean, there's so many different components, so many different vendors involved, especially if you're having to erect towers, poles, do permits, all that good stuff, right? These are all things that we're dealing with as we're rolling these, solutions out. And the key is really picking an integrator such as Insight, right, that has these relationships and they know the process from start to finish. And more importantly, which partners to bring in to have those conversations to develop what that business or use case is. And then from that, you define the technology solution, whereas maybe previously in the enterprise space, it might be somewhat flipped around. There's a lot more moving parts to this. And it can be expensive, or maybe not so much. But those are all the things, right, that you need to reach out to the right integrator that has those relationships developed to kind of work through all of that stuff. Thank
you both. To answer two quick questions in the stream, and then we'll close out. Somebody's asking about citywide internet, and then the question was, would CARES dollars be available for that? I think we know the quick answer to that is yes, and we talked about that in a previous LinkedIn Live with the City of Tucson, with Colin, like we had mentioned earlier. So those answers to you guys is yes.
Yes, and there's actually a new round of funding that I believe just got approved or in legislature that is going to be going out to all 50 states, and that's going to be tribal, municipalities, state and local level. So, I mean, that's the really nice thing about these is that there is funding available out there. Yeah. And for these digital divide use cases, that's essential for tons of communities, but it also positions those communities to take advantage of what the potential is of these solutions, which is IoT, smart cities, revenue generation, providing public Wi-Fi across the place to drive in more tourism. I mean, you name it. I mean, it really just opens the door. And the nice thing is there is funding out there available depending on where you sit on the spectrum. So yeah, definitely.
Well, awesome. Well, Mike, thank you. Mike, thank you for joining us today. It's been a great session. I think, this is an interesting point that we set out as with a lot of our conversations. There's a lot of cool stuff that we can do. We really appreciate you guys out there in internet land sending us your questions, and we hope we answered those for you. If you'd like to see more about what we do here at Insight and at CDCT, please visit us at insightcdct.com and join us next time. Thanks, and have a good day.
Right.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Guys.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Mike.